The heavy silence of a quiet, tree-lined Los Angeles neighborhood was violently shattered on the night of May 19, 2014. At approximately 8:30 in the evening, a calm, almost chillingly detached voice spoke into a telephone during a routine call to the emergency police dispatcher. The man on the other end did not report a robbery, a medical emergency, or a break-in. Instead, he delivered a confession that would freeze the blood of the operator and eventually stun the entire world. He said simply, and without a hint of panic, "I shot my wife." When the authorities arrived at the modest home in the Hyde Park area of the city, they did not find a career criminal, a gang member, or a desperate stranger. They found Michael Jace, a celebrated actor, a man who had spent 7 long seasons portraying a high-principled police officer named Julian Lowe on the hit television series The Shield. The scene inside the residence was a visceral, heartbreaking nightmare that no film script could ever adequately capture. April Jace, a vibrant and beloved 40-year-old mother who worked as a respected financial aid advisor at Biola University, lay dead in the hallway of her own home. But the horror did not stop with the victim. Even more haunting was the presence of the couple's 2 young sons, aged only 5 and 8 years old at the time. These children had not just heard the heated argument or the deafening blasts of the revolver. They had stood in the terrifying shadows of the hallway and witnessed the final, agonizing moments of their mother's life. The man they were supposed to look up to as a protector and a hero had transformed into their greatest predator. Michael Jace, a Lo, a physical giant standing over 6 feet 3 inches tall and weighing more than 200 pounds, sat calmly waiting for the police to arrive. He surrendered without a single moment of resistance, leaving behind a shattered family and a film industry that was left grasping for answers. The news of the arrest sent a massive, seismic shock through the heart of Hollywood. Michael Jace was not some struggling, unknown background actor looking for his big break. He was a powerhouse performer with over 52 professional acting credits and more than 20 years of experience in the business. He was a face that audiences recognized from sharing the screen with legendary A-list actors like Harrison Ford, Tom Hanks, and Mark Wahlberg. He was the man who had been chosen to play the icon Michael Jordan in a major television movie, a role that required immense discipline and a commanding presence. To the viewing public, Jace was a symbol of strength, Christian faith, and professional success. But as the police investigation began to peel back the layers of his private life, it became agonizingly clear that the man the world saw on the screen was nothing more than a carefully crafted mask. Behind the accolades and the fame was a man drowning in more than $500,000 of debt and harboring a toxic, violent temper that was rapidly reaching its fatal breaking point. The central question that gripped the entire nation was a simple but devastating: why? How does a man who seemingly had everything, a high-profile career, a beautiful and successful wife, and 2 healthy, innocent children decide to execute his spouse in cold blood in front of his own flesh and blood? This was not a simple crime of passion or a sudden, unexplained accident. It was the final, explosive climax of a decade-long internal decay. As we examine the life of Michael Jace, we find a story of a man whose pride was as massive as his physical stature, and who simply could not handle the reality of a world that no longer viewed him as a rising star. The tragedy of that night in 2014 was not a mistake. It was a calculated, cruel finale to a life built on a foundation of hidden rage and professional frustration. As Michael Jace sat in heavy handcuffs, he attempted to tell the detectives that he only intended to hurt his wife, to shoot her in the leg so she would feel physical pain, but not to take her life. However, the forensic evidence, the cold logic of the weapon used, and the chilling testimony of his own young son would eventually tell a much different and more sinister story. It was a story of taunting, of psychological warfare, and of a man who used a firearm to permanently silence the woman who finally had the courage to ask for a divorce. This investigation is a journey through the darkest hour of a Hollywood star, a look at the fatal intersection where financial ruin meets domestic violence, and a tribute to April Jace, a woman who tried to run toward a new life of freedom, only to be stopped forever by the man she once promised to love. To understand how Michael Jace reached that blood-stained hallway in 2014, we must look back at the origins of a man who seemed destined for greatness. Born on July 13, 1962, in Paterson, New Jersey, Michael was a physical marvel. Standing at 6 feet 3 inches and weighing over 200 pounds, he was a dominant athlete in high school, excelling in both basketball and baseball. At that time, there was no indication of the darkness that would later consume him. He was simply a talented young man from New Jersey looking for a way to make his mark on the world. The shift from the sports arena to the theatrical stage happened by accident during his college years. Michael was drawn into acting after watching his girlfriend take drama classes. He observed the rehearsals and famously remarked that it looked easy. When he finally stepped onto the stage himself, he discovered he was a natural. He possessed a rare ability to project both immense physical power and a surprising vulnerability. This duality became his trademark. He wasn't just another big guy for hire. He was an actor who could command a room with a single glance, a quality that casting directors in Los Angeles quickly began to notice. His professional journey began in 1992 with a guest role on Law and Order. This was the spark that ignited a rise through the ranks of Hollywood. Throughout the 1990s, Michael Jace became a reliable and sought-after character actor. In 1994, he played a Black Panther in the classic Forrest Gump with Tom Hanks. That same year, he shared the screen with Harrison Ford in Clear and Present Danger. By 1995, he was working with Angela Bassett in Strange Days and portraying the boxer Mitch Green in the movie Tyson. His resume was becoming a who is who of cinematic greatness. The momentum continued as he landed a role in the 1996 comedy The Great White Hype with Samuel L. Jackson and Jamie Foxx, followed by the thriller The Fan with Robert De Niro. In 1999, he achieved a career-defining moment when he was cast as the lead in Michael Jordan, An American Hero. Playing the most famous athlete on the planet required a level of charisma that few could provide, and Jace delivered. He was no longer just a supporting player. He was a leading man standing on the threshold of becoming one of the greats, alongside names like Denzel Washington. The peak of his career arrived in 2002, when he was cast as Detective Julian Lowe in the hit series The Shield. For 7 seasons and 89 episodes, Michael Jace became a household name. His character was complex, a devout Christian officer struggling with his own internal conflicts. Audiences loved the nuance he brought to the role, and for many, Jace was the moral compass of the show. He was earning a steady income and enjoyed a level of job security that most actors only dream of. During this time, he also found personal happiness, marrying April Jace in 2003. But beneath the surface, the darkest hour was already taking shape. As The Shield drew to a close in 2008, the steady stream of roles began to dry up. Michael was no longer the hot new talent. He was an aging actor in a youth-obsessed business. As his income plummeted from hundreds of thousands to just $70,000 a year, the pressure of a celebrity lifestyle started to crush him. The man who had played Michael Jordan was now facing a reality he could not control. The natural giant was about to find out that when you fall from such a height, the impact can destroy everything. The transition from a television star to a man in financial ruin was a slow and agonizing process that stripped Michael Jace of his dignity. By 2011, the steady paychecks from his 89 episodes on The Shield were a distant memory. The actor who once shared the screen with legends was now struggling to generate even $70,000 a year. For most, this would be a livable wage. But for a Hollywood actor attempting to maintain a mortgage on a large home and provide for a family of 4, it was a recipe for disaster. The utopian experience of fame had been replaced by the darkest hour of bankruptcy. Michael was drowning in a sea of red ink, owing over $22,000 in state and federal taxes and facing a mountain of credit card debt. The financial pressure created a toxic environment inside the Jace household. Michael's home was facing foreclosure, and although he had attempted to set up a payment plan, he had already fallen behind by over $2,000. In total, his liabilities ranged between $500,000 and $1 million. This was not just about numbers on a page. It was a devastating blow to his ego. He was a man who stood 6 feet 3 inches tall, a natural giant who was used to being the provider and the hero. Now, he was a man who couldn't pay his bills, and his wife, April Jace, had become the primary stable earner in the family. April was a successful financial aid advisor at Biola University, and as she flourished, Michael's resentment grew in the shadows of his own failure. As the money disappeared, Michael's behavior began to shift from frustration to a dangerous, controlling pattern of emotional abuse. While the neighbors saw a quiet, professional couple, the reality behind closed doors was becoming increasingly volatile. Michael became obsessed with the idea that he was losing control of his life and, by extension, his wife. He began to harbor deep, unfounded suspicions that April was having an affair. This paranoia was fueled by his own feelings of inadequacy as his acting career continued to stall. He wasn't just losing his house, he was losing his sense of self-worth, and he chose to project that internal rot onto the woman who was trying her best to keep the family afloat. The most chilling aspect of this decline was the hidden history of violence that April was likely unaware of when she married him. Long before the events of 2014, Michael had a documented history of domestic abuse with his first wife, Jennifer Bitterman. Back in 1997, during his previous marriage, witnesses had observed Michael becoming physically violent. One friend testified that she saw Michael choke his ex-wife and slam her head into a wall while their infant son cried in a crib just a few feet away. This was the true Michael Jace, a man who used his massive physical stature to intimidate and silence the women in his life whenever he felt his authority was being questioned. By the spring of 2014, the marriage had reached a breaking point. April Jace, a woman known for her joy and her passion for running, was no longer willing to live in the shadow of Michael's rage. She was a mother of 2 young boys, and she realized that the environment Michael was creating was no longer safe for her or her children. The financial ruin, the constant accusations of infidelity, and the suffocating control had become too much to bear. She began to plan her exit, unaware that Michael was watching her every move with a growing sense of desperation. He saw her desire for freedom as the ultimate betrayal, a final insult to his dwindling status as a man. The stage was now set for a catastrophe. Michael Jace was a man with a loaded weapon, a broken bank account, and a mind consumed by a darkest hour from which he saw no escape. He was no longer the heroic detective Julian Lowe. He was a desperate individual who believed that if he couldn't control his wife, no one would have her. The pride that had built his career was now the very thing that was about to destroy it. On the morning of May 19th, the tension that had been building for years was finally ready to explode, and the consequences would be more horrific than anything Hollywood had ever put on film. The morning of May 19th, 2014, began like any other day for April Jace. But for Michael, it was the beginning of a terminal descent. April was a woman of immense discipline and vitality. She was a former track star who still found solace in the rhythm of running. She worked as a financial aid counselor at Biola University, where she was known for her infectious laugh and her dedication to helping students. But that morning, she had finally reached her limit. After 9 years of marriage and countless nights of enduring Michael's suffocating control and financial instability, she told him the words he feared most. She wanted a divorce. This declaration was the spark that turned his simmering resentment into a lethal, focused rage. After April left the house for work, the psychological warfare began. Throughout the day, Michael bombarded her with a barrage of text messages. He was obsessed with the idea that she was having an affair, constantly demanding to know who she was sleeping with. These messages were not the pleas of a heartbroken husband. They were the interrogations of a man who viewed his wife as property. April's responses, preserved in her iPhone, painted a picture of a woman living in absolute terror. She texted back that she was afraid to come home, stating that his anger was so intense she feared for her life. She told him she didn't want him to make a scene or break things in front of their 2 sons. In a calculated move to lure her back into his reach, Michael lied. He texted April and told her that he had left the house, giving her a false sense of security so she would return to pick up their children. It was a trap. Instead of leaving, Michael stayed in the dark, empty house, drinking heavily and ruminating on his perceived betrayals. He went to a closet and retrieved a loaded revolver, a weapon he had no business using. He sat in the shadows, fueled by alcohol and a darkest hour mentality, waiting for the woman who had dared to choose her own path. He wasn't just waiting for a conversation. He was waiting to execute a plan that would ensure she could never run away from him again. At approximately 8 o'clock that evening, April pulled into the driveway. She had just picked up their two sons, aged 5 and 8, from a local baseball game. The children were still in their uniforms, exhausted and happy, completely unaware that their lives were about to be permanently scarred. When April walked through the front door, she was met not by an empty house, but by a husband whose eyes were filled with a terrifying, drunken resolve. Michael confronted her immediately, the argument reigniting with a fresh and deadly intensity. As the boys stood in the hallway, Michael ordered them to go to their room. It was the last time they would ever see their mother alive and unharmed. The confrontation reached its peak in the hallway. As April turned to move away from him, Michael drew his weapon. He fired a single shot into her back, the force of the bullet knocking the former track star to the ground. As she lay there, wounded and defenseless, Michael did something far more sinister than a simple act of violence. He began to taunt her, mocking the very thing that gave her joy. He stood over her and reportedly said, "If you like running so much, why don't you try running to heaven?" With cold, calculated precision, he then fired 2 more rounds into her legs. He wanted to ensure that if she survived, she would never be able to run again. The cruelty of the act was staggering. He had shot her in the back and then punished her specifically in her legs, the tools of her athletic passion. After the final shots echoed through the house, Michael Jace did not flee. He did not try to hide the body. Instead, he called his father-in-law and his brother-in-law, telling them both that he had just shot April and that someone needed to come and get the children. Finally, he called the police and calmly waited on the front porch for the sirens to arrive. He had completed his mission of total control, oblivious to the fact that he had just destroyed the lives of the 2 boys sitting in the next room, listening to their mother's final breaths. The legal battle that followed the death of April Jace was a grueling confrontation between a man seeking mercy and a prosecution seeking absolute justice. When the trial began in 2016, Michael Jace stood before the court, not as a hero, but as a defendant facing a potential life sentence. From the very beginning, his legal team adopted a strategic, albeit controversial, approach. They did not deny that Michael had pulled the trigger. The physical evidence and Michael's own confession made a not guilty plea impossible. Instead, they argued for a conviction of voluntary manslaughter. They claimed that Michael had acted in the heat of passion, driven to a temporary state of insanity by the crushing weight of his financial ruin and the sudden, devastating news of his wife's desire for a divorce. His lawyers painted a picture of a man who had simply snapped under the pressure of the darkest hour. They argued that the shooting was a spontaneous explosion of emotion, not a premeditated execution. Michael took the stand and tearfully maintained that his original plan for that night was to take his own life. He claimed he had retrieved the revolver to commit suicide, but when April arrived and the argument escalated, his despair turned into a blind, uncontrollable rage. He insisted that he only intended to shoot her in the leg to inflict pain, a twisted attempt to make her feel the same agony he was feeling, and that the shot to her back was a tragic accident during the struggle. The prosecution, however, systematically dismantled this narrative of a spontaneous accident. They presented a mountain of evidence that pointed toward a calculated and deliberate act of murder. The most devastating evidence came from the couple's 10-year-old son, who took the witness stand to testify against his father. In a heart-wrenching testimony that silenced the entire courtroom, the young boy recounted the chilling words he heard his father speak as he stood over his wounded mother. The boy confirmed that Michael had taunted April about her passion for running before firing the final shots into her legs. This testimony was the smoking gun that proved Michael's actions were not just violent, but sadistic and premeditated. To further prove premeditation, the prosecution introduced the text messages recovered from April's iPhone. These messages showed that Michael had been planning a confrontation for hours. The fact that he had lied to April, telling her he had left the house to lure her back into a trap, proved a level of calculation that was incompatible with a heat of passion defense. Furthermore, the prosecution highlighted the mechanics of the weapon itself. Michael had used a double-action revolver, which requires a significant and deliberate amount of pressure on the trigger for every single shot fired. You do not accidentally fire a revolver 3 separate times, including once into a victim's back while they are trying to retreat. As the trial reached its climax, The prosecution also brought up Michael's hidden history of domestic violence. By showing that he had a pattern of using his physical size to intimidate and harm women, they proved that the events of May 19th were not an isolated incident of a man snapping, but rather the final, lethal expression of a lifelong character flaw. They argued that Michael Jace didn't kill his wife because he was sad or bankrupt. He killed her because he was a controlling abuser who would rather see his wife dead than free. The jury was left to decide if the man sitting at the defense table was a broken victim of circumstance or a cold-blooded killer who had carefully orchestrated his wife's demise. The deliberations were intense, but the evidence was overwhelming. The jury saw through the remorseful actor persona that Michael attempted to project in the courtroom. They recognized that a man who shoots his wife in front of his children and mocks her as she dies is not a man who deserves the leniency of a manslaughter conviction. The trial was a masterclass in the pursuit of truth, stripping away the Hollywood glamour to reveal the raw, ugly reality of domestic homicide. After a week of testimony, the fate of Michael Jace was handed over to the boy Thum Doan, the jury, who were tasked with determining if the natural giant would spend the rest of his life paying for his crimes. The tension in the Los Angeles courtroom reached a breaking point on May 31, 2016, as the jury returned with a decision that would finalize the fall of Michael Jace. After a week of listening to the harrowing details of April's final moments and viewing the digital trail of Michael's obsessive rage, the boy Thum Doan, the jury delivered their verdict. They found Michael Jace guilty of second-degree murder. While the defense had fought desperately for a lesser charge of voluntary manslaughter, the jury determined that the act of shooting a woman 3 times, including twice in the legs to prevent her from running, carried a level of implied malice that surpassed a mere heat-of-passion crime. The sentencing hearing that followed in June was an emotional battlefield. Members of April Jace's family stood before the court to deliver victim impact statements that painted a devastating picture of the void Michael had created. April's mother, Kay Henry, spoke through tears, describing her daughter as a joyful person who lived for her children. She addressed the court with a profound sense of loss, stating that on the night April died, the entire family's future was murdered along with her. The focus of the room was not on the actor's faded fame, but on the 2 young boys who were now orphans of a domestic war, left to process the image of their father standing over their mother with a smoking gun. When it was Michael's turn to speak, the natural giant was a broken man. Gone was the commanding presence of Detective Julian Lowe, or the athletic confidence of Michael Jordan. He stood before the judge and the grieving family, weeping as he offered a formal apology. He insisted that there was no justification for his actions that night, and claimed he was profoundly sorry for the pain he had caused. He maintained until the very end that he never intended to kill April, but rather that his mind had been clouded by a darkest hour of financial ruin and perceived betrayal. However, his tears did little to sway the court, as the cruelty of his taunts during the shooting remained the defining memory of the case. The judge was unmoved by the actor's display of remorse, focusing instead on the cold-blooded nature of the execution. Under California law, the use of a firearm in the commission of a murder carries a significant sentencing enhancement. Consequently, Michael Jace was sentenced to 40 years to life in state prison. The breakdown of the sentence included 15 years for the second-degree murder charge and an additional 25 years because he had personally and intentionally discharged a firearm causing death. At 53 years old at the time of sentencing, the math was clear. Michael Jace would likely spend the remainder of his natural life behind bars. As the deputies led him away in handcuffs, the reality of his utopian experience in Hollywood was officially over. He was no longer a man with over 52 acting credits. He was inmate number BB8034. The man who once pulled in $80,000 a year as a television star would now be earning pennies an hour for manual labor in a correctional facility. The industry that had once embraced his talent quickly distanced itself, leaving his name to be associated primarily with domestic tragedy rather than cinematic achievement. The natural giant had been toppled, not by an external enemy, but by the internal demons of pride, debt, and an inability to let go of control. The sentencing of Michael Jace served as a high-profile reminder that fame provides no immunity from the consequences of domestic violence. The legal system had sent a clear message: Regardless of how many police officers you have portrayed on television, you are not above the law when you turn a weapon on your own family. As the courtroom cleared and the cameras stopped rolling, the focus shifted away from the fallen star and back to the victim. The tragedy was complete, leaving a community to mourn a woman who was killed for wanting a new beginning and a legal legacy that would forever mark Michael Jace as a cautionary tale of Hollywood's darkest shadows. In the aftermath of the trial, the spotlight finally shifted away from the fallen actor and back toward the woman whose life was so cruelly extinguished. April Jace was much more than a victim in a celebrity scandal. She was a pillar of her community and a beacon of hope for those around her. To honor her memory, Biola University, where she had worked as a dedicated financial aid counselor, established the April Jace Memorial Scholarship. This fund was designed to assist students who, like April, demonstrated a commitment to service and a passion for overcoming adversity. The director of the university noted that April was a person of infectious joy, someone who could light up a room with her laughter. Her legacy is now carried forward by the students who receive this aid, ensuring that her name is associated with opportunity rather than tragedy. For the two young sons of Michael and April, the journey toward healing has been long and arduous. Having witnessed the darkest hour of their family's history, the boys were placed in the care of relatives who have worked tirelessly to provide them with the stability their father destroyed. While they are shielded from the media glare, the psychological scars of that night in 2014 remain. They are the silent victims of a broken shield, children who had to learn the hardest lesson of all, that sometimes the people who are supposed to protect you are the ones you should fear the most. The boys are reportedly doing well in their new environment, but they carry the heavy burden of a mother lost and a father who became a stranger. The case of Michael Jace also forced a difficult conversation within the entertainment industry regarding the mental health of aging actors. As the utopian experience of a steady role on a hit show ends, many performers face a devastating identity crisis. For Jace, the transition from a famous detective to a man facing foreclosure and a $1 million debt was a bridge he could not cross. His story highlights the desperate need for better support systems for those navigating the volatile peaks and valleys of fame. It serves as a reminder that the pressure to maintain an image of success can lead to a dangerous internal rot that, if left untreated, can explode into senseless violence. Furthermore, this tragedy exposed the reality that domestic violence does not always leave a visible trail. Neighbors and co-workers of the Jace family were stunned by the murder because they had never seen or heard any signs of trouble. There were no previous police calls to the home and no public displays of aggression. This hidden nature of abuse is what makes it so lethal. It proves that a natural giant can maintain a professional, calm exterior while harboring a monster within. The April Jace case has since been used by advocacy groups to teach people that a lack of physical bruises does not mean a relationship is safe, especially when financial control and psychological intimidation are present. As Michael Jace serves his 40-year sentence, he remains a pariah in the industry he once served. His 52 acting credits are now overshadowed by a single, horrific act of cowardice. The man who portrayed a devout Christian officer and a legendary athlete will spend his final years in a concrete cell, a far cry from the red carpets of Hollywood. His fall from grace was absolute, proving that no amount of talent or fame can shield a person from the consequences of their choices. He is a man who had the world at his feet but chose to burn it all down because he could not handle the loss of control. Ultimately, the story of Michael Jace is a tragedy in 3 acts: the rise of a natural talent, the decay caused by pride and debt, and the final, bloody collapse. But the final word belongs to April. She was a woman who loved to run, who found freedom in every stride, and who died trying to reach a new finish line for her and her children. Though she was stopped in that hallway, her spirit lives on in the scholarship that bears her name and the 2 boys who continue to grow in spite of the darkness. The shield may be broken, but the memory of April Jace remains a steady, guiding light for all those who seek the courage to run toward their own freedom.